Thank you for the invitation to speak in this session, which addresses the really important question of drivers of food intake. What I'd like to do in my presentation is really try and provide a context for this question of what's driving our food choices, and also provide an overview of some relevant data from a psychobiological perspective that I hope might go some way to answering that question. But before I do that, this is just to acknowledge my funding sources, membership of advisory panels, and also to acknowledge my collaborators on some of the research that I'm talking about today. So, the question of who's in charge of our food choices is clearly very important in the context of concerns about dietary health and also rising levels of obesity. On the one hand, we have the idea that really we're totally in charge of our own food choices, that these are taken completely voluntarily, that involve some kind of deliberative choice, and that given a number of options, we always have the ability to choose otherwise. But on the other hand, there's an argument that in fact we don't really have ability to choose at all in the context of eating decisions, that in fact we are driven in some way to behave in certain ways around food, and in other words, our behavior is actually determined in some way either by our biology or indeed by the current food environment. So a strong form of the environmental determinist view suggests that really we're at the mercy of our food environment, that we're surrounded by various food cues and that we're really responding to those cues in a rather mindless kind of fashion. So it may be that we eat more than we intend to because we're surrounded by pictures of food, food advertising, and also we're exposed to very large portion sizes and also things like an immense variety of tasty foods. The biological determinists would argue that, in fact, we are prone to eating certain foods and indeed over-consuming because of our genes, and that we have inherited from our ancestors so-called thrifty genes that promote the laying down of fat, which would have enabled us to survive during periods of famine in our evolutionary history. So this means that today, these thrifty genes are driving us to over-consume palatable foods. Now, clearly these are quite extreme points of view, and so it's worth actually perhaps considering them in more detail. So to take the idea of the environmental determinism, the notion that really our eating is rather mindless and solely determined by these cues in the environment is a rather attractive one because, of course, eating is something that we do very naturally. We eat several meals a day and it all appears rather effortless. But perhaps it's worth considering other highly practiced tasks, and we might think about, say, driving a car, which, again, we all seem to be able to perform quite effortlessly, and may appear mindless on the surface, but if we dig a bit deeper, then we can say that actually, in order to properly drive a car, we're having to coordinate lots of complex cognitive processes that involve paying attention, coordinating perceptual motor skills, memory, and also more complex kinds of decision making. So we might ask the question, is eating behavior actually so different? Because in fact, of course, it's highly practiced. If we think about the number of meals that the average adult has consumed, it's rather a lot. And we may consider actually that this means that we're rather expert at eating. And the idea that underlying our eating behavior are these rather complex cognitive systems is now gaining more ground. And this is one of the things that I'm going to touch upon later in my presentation and will also come out in some of the later sessions. In terms of the biological determinist view, the thrifty gene hypothesis has also been challenged, and there's a very interesting position that's been put forward by John Speakman, that in fact, if the thrifty gene hypothesis were true, then of course, by this stage in our evolutionary history, we would all indeed be obese. And of course, we're not quite there, certainly not all obese yet. And what John Speakman suggests is that rather than actually being actively selected for, we currently have a situation where there are genes that do promote overconsumption, but that these are actually distributed throughout the population according to previous random genetic mutation. And so what this means is, in fact, that there are some people who are prone to overconsume and gain weight, but this is certainly not the case for everybody. And all of this means that actually, even when we're confronted with the same food environment, there are huge individual differences in how people respond. And we found that in a study here where we looked at the weight gain that occurred over the first year of university for some UK students. So many of you will be familiar, I think, with the idea of the freshman 15, which is the weight gain that students are meant to experience when they move to university. Coming into a new eating environment. And indeed, in our study, we did find that overall there was a modest amount of weight gain, but in fact this was masked by a huge amount of individual differences. So what you can see here, is the change in weight over 3 months and 12 months. And you can see that certainly there were some people that gained a lot of weight, but there were people also who didn't gain weight at all, and indeed some people who lost quite a lot of weight. So here we can see that there are these individual differences in how we're responding to the same food environment. So does the fact that clearly some people are able to control their food intake mean, therefore, that we do have free will over our food choices? Now, at this point, I don't really want to get into a serious philosophical debate about the nature of free will, but what I did want to do is share with you this quote from the philosopher John Searle, which I think quite nicely illustrates the idea that, of course, we're very tied to our sense of free will. I'm in a restaurant, the waiter asks me, what would I like? I cannot say I'm a determinist, I'll just wait and see what happens. So, free will is something that we find desirable. It's also important for notions of moral responsibility. But is it really the case that we are truly free to make our food choices? One way of thinking about this is to say, are we really truly unconstrained and always able to deliberate on our food choices? And I'd also like to argue that this is indeed not the case. That in fact our food choices are influenced by a multitude of factors that are going to be pushing, nudging us in various ways. And I've just outlined some of those factors here, so we can highlight that these choices about what foods to eat and how much to eat are going to be influenced by the context that we're in, various individual characteristics, characteristics of the food, and also our personal history, our learning about foods. And so food choices are really the outcome of the integration of these different factors. And some of these factors we're going to hear about later on in the session from the other presentations, and some of which I'm going to just highlight in a little detail now. But first of all, just to try and make this perhaps a little bit more concrete, if we think of an example of where we're exposed to a food cue in the environment, that might be the sight of food, smell, or even a picture of food in advertising. This is going to trigger a response that might be thinking about food, bringing food to mind, which is then going to initiate a food-seeking response. So that's the basic response to a food cue, which is learned. But how we respond to those food cues is also affected by our current metabolic state, so our state of hunger, in that actually, if we are hungry, we're going to be much more responsive to these food cues. That then is going to feed through to the kinds of choices that we make, but of course, once we've made those choices, there are consequences, and that is then going to feed back to obviously influence our current metabolic state, state of nutritional need. But also we're going to be learning about those consequences, and we're going to use that information, therefore, to predict future behaviours. And so we're learning there about the effects of food on the body. So that's experience. And of course, there are higher goals that may influence both our response to food cues and food choices. And this might be our desire to lose weight or make particularly healthful choices. And so what I will argue is that individual differences in all of these aspects here are going to have an effect on food choices. So in terms of responses to food cues, Kent Berridge has argued in his incentive sensitization theory that we have a hedonic response to a food, which is then through learning going to mean that we come to find that food attractive, or we want it, we will seek it out. And that there are various brain neurochemical systems that underlie these responses. So on the one hand, we have the brain opioid, GABA and cannabinoid systems that are responsible for the hedonic or liking response, and brain dopamine systems that are important for wanting. And of course, then we might say that individual differences in these neurochemical systems might affect our responses to food cues. And indeed, this has been found. So for instance, we can see that genetic variability in these brain systems actually contributes to reactivity to food cues. And something else we're going to hear more about later on in the session is the idea that obese people actually do respond very strongly to food cues, and this may be related to activity in brain reward systems, as Eric Stice will discuss. But of course, these responses are going to be affected by our metabolic needs. And this is due to the fact that our brain reward systems are actually intimately linked with systems that are signaling metabolic need. And these are the appetite hormones such as ghrelin and leptin. So what you can see in this slide here are the results of studies showing that the two hormones, ghrelin and leptin, actually can act on these brain dopamine systems to affect food intake. And this is studies in rats shown here. But this underlies that actually variation in those metabolic systems are also going to be affecting the response to food cues. And this is nicely illustrated by the finding that in individuals who have a congenital lack of leptin show excessive responses to food cues even when they're satiated. So what you can see in this slide here is activity in the brain of individuals who lack leptin. And here, even when they're satiated, we can see that they're showing very strong responses in brain reward circuits. But this is actually reversed when the leptin that's missing is replaced through leptin therapy. And we can also, in addition to these metabolic effects, inhibit our responses to food cues through top-down inhibitory control. And so the general ability to inhibit an action once we've initiated it has actually been shown to be related to successful weight control, although these effects, interestingly, are moderated by sensitivity to reward. So this is a nice example of where these systems are interacting. And how people respond may be influenced by the extent to which they have a hedonic versus a health goal that is activated when they're exposed to these kinds of food cues. So what you can see in the next slide here is an illustration of that, where in this panel here, what is plotted is results of a study which looked at participants' ability to stop themselves from pressing a button once they'd been told to do so. And how that relates to their reward sensitivity. So you can see this is weight change over 1 year. And here, for people that have a high implicit preference for food, those who are effective at this top-down response inhibition are losing a little bit of weight over 1 year, but those who have a problem in response inhibition are actually the ones who are gaining weight. And that's not actually true for people who don't have this high preference for palatable foods. And in this slide here, you can also see another example of where our ability to inhibit responses is related to how we respond to palatable foods in terms of their reward value. So in this study, the measure of inhibition was effectively a measure of the ability to delay gratification. So this is something known as delay discounting. And what you can see here is plotted the relationship between how willing the participants are to work for a food reward, so this is a measure of their motivation, against how much they actually consume. And what we can see is that for those who are not very good at delaying gratification, there is a very strong relationship there between their energy intake and their willingness to work for food. And that is much less strong in people who do have this tendency to be able to wait in order to gain something that they desire. So that is an example of an interaction between these different influences. It's also important to note that our ability to behave according to these higher goals is affected by other aspects of our environment. So we've shown that actually if somebody's thinking about food, then this automatically enhances their ability to detect food cues in the environment. But on the other hand, if people, especially dieters, are exposed to cues that remind them of their health goals, then actually this seems to be helpful in curbing intake. And those sorts of effects appear to be related to activity in areas of the brain that are responsible for this kind of high-level inhibition. And something we've also been interested in is the idea that actually social influences are extremely important influences on food choice. So this is the idea that actually some of our food choices are motivated because we want to make a certain impression on others, or if we want to actually fit in. So just to quickly highlight then some examples using specific studies, what you can see in this slide here are the results of a study that I just mentioned, where we asked people to think about an apple. We actually asked them, well, different foods as well, keep an apple in mind, and we then looked at their responses to detecting the location of this target here, which is a circle. And the bottom line is that when people have an apple in mind, they're memorizing an apple, they're much faster then to respond to this cue when it's next to the thing that they're thinking about. And this is their very quick reaction time here. And conversely, when the target is actually next to something else in this array that they're meant to be responding to, then they have a very slow reaction time. So this tells us that actually our current preoccupations, things that we're thinking about, affect our responses to food cues in the environment. Here are the results of studies that primed dieters with thoughts of their diet. So in this study, it was actually a field study in a butcher's shop where people saw a recipe for a slimming recipe. And what you can see here is that in the restrained eaters, in the control condition, when offered snacks on entering the shop, they ate well, on average one snack here, but this was actually then reduced on average when they were actually exposed to this diet reminder. And a similar result can be seen here, where participants were exposed to images of diet-related cues. And here the dieters are consuming much less in a subsequent taste test when they've been exposed to reminders of the diet than if they were just exposed to neutral control images. And finally here, to illustrate the importance of social norms, we found that if participants were reminded of what other people had done in an experiment, so this is where they were accidentally exposed to information about how much other participants had eaten, we could really affect their own consumption. So, what you can see here is the results of the taste test, where previously they were told that accidentally that people didn't eat very much versus other people had eaten very much, or where they were not given any information about how the other participants had behaved. And you can see here that there's a nice relationship. More recently, we've also looked at the effect of providing information about how other people behave in the form of educational flyers and posters. So here we're telling students that actually other fellow students eat more vegetables than they might imagine. And what we found is that then subsequently, when they're offered the opportunity to choose freely their own meal, that those who were already habitually low consumers of vegetables increased their consumption when they were exposed to this social information relative to when they were given a traditional health message about how you should eat fruit and veg because it's good for you. And we found that the high consumers weren't really affected, but that's probably because they were already adhering to this normative information that we were providing. So finally, I'd just like to talk about the important role of experience in guiding our food choices. So humans are really born with very limited reactions to foods. We accept sweet-tasting substances and we reject bitter-tasting substances. But of course, this changes as we get experience with foods, and we can come to like even rather bitter substances like coffee and olives, etc. And this can happen through a process of learning about cues and consequences. consequences. So, for instance, we demonstrated in the laboratory that people could come to like an initially neutral fruit-flavoured tea when they were increasingly paired with eating sweets, so a positive reward. So here you can see the more often the sweet was paired with the tea, eventually the more they came to like this tea that initially really wasn't terribly liked. So we know a lot about how people can learn these kinds of food preferences, but it's also the case that we can learn about the nutritional consequences of eating. So we know that people are very good at figuring out how filling foods are going to be, and they do this via experience. So this is some research from Jeff Brunstrom, which shows that if you ask people how satiating they expect a food to be, they're very good at saying what they think in terms of how that's going to fill them up. And in fact, this improves over time, so that what you can see here is that the more familiar we are with the food, the more filling we expect it to be. And these expectancies about satiation are very important because they actually allow us to predict the future. And what happens is that we actually then anticipate the fillingness of foods, and that determines what we put on our plate. So here you can see that there's a very nice relationship between these satiety expectations and what people actually serve themselves. And we found that these satiety expectations are based on memories. So if you take amnesic patients who unfortunately cannot actually store memories of any kind, including food memories, we find that they're not very good at these sorts of expectations about satiety, and they just overeat. As you give them more and more food, they just eat more and more. And we've also found that actually food memories are an even more important aspect of appetite after one has eaten. So this is a clever study again by Jeff Brunstrom that looked at manipulating the amount of soup that participants consumed. So they either saw and ate the same amount, or effectively a false memory was implanted whereby what they saw was not what they ate, because food, this case soup, was actually added or removed from the bowl. And this resulted in these various conditions here. And what we can see, interestingly, is that actually immediately after, these are hunger ratings, the hunger ratings are influenced very much by what the participants actually ate. But this changes over time, such that 180 minutes after eating, what you can see here is that actually the hunger is really being very much influenced by what they saw and not what they actually ate. And so this suggests that these appetite ratings after lunch are being influenced by these cognitive processes. And indeed, this of course suggests that if we were to disrupt the formation of these food memories, it should affect later appetite. And we showed this by disrupting the meal memory by asking people to watch TV. So people ate a TV dinner and then came back for a biscuit taste test, or just ate ordinarily without any TV. And we found that the TV disrupted the memory, and this meant that they actually ate more snacks later. And this effect was related to the vividness of their food memories. And of course, this suggests actually an opportunity, because we've also found that, indeed, on the other hand, rather than disrupting food memories, if you actually improve them by getting people to really focus on what they're eating, you can actually decrease the amount of snacking that occurs later. And this is also correlated with their memory vividness. So to conclude then, I hope what I've been able to convince you of during this presentation is that we really can't think of food choices as being a simple and straightforward matter of personal responsibility on the one hand versus these very strong forms of environmental or biological determinism on the other hand. And in fact, really we should be thinking of food choices as being underpinned by these incredibly complex cognitive processes, and that actually we can facilitate or indeed undermine these in various ways. But I do think that that also offers up opportunities in that, of course, it provides perhaps a novel way of trying to manipulate food choices. So I'd just like to finish then by thanking you for your attention, and I look forward to any questions.